In the 2009 Mamoru Hosoda film Summer Wars, the following words of warm advice are offered by a grandmother to a family torn apart. And if you remember nothing else, remember to find time together as a family, even when times are rough, especially when times are rough. There's no lack of painful things in this world, but hunger and loneliness must surely be two of the worst. In my own ministry work in Toukley, I've seen the power and grace of sharing meals together. We run a community cafe a couple of days a week, which was on a long break because of obviously COVID, but we're back, and it's been so exciting because, yes, there are those who come because they appreciate a free meal, because, a lot of folks up here on New Start and the like, and New Start, once you pay rent and a couple of other fixed expenses, there's not much there. So a free meal is great, but, most are coming primarily for the community. And most people who come stay for a bunch of hours, and I love it. Finally, it's like a bit of distinctiveness in the week, that makes a Tuesday different to a Wednesday. But, it's also just, this time to sit and talk and eat and talk and sit and eat some more, enjoying going somewhere where you're not going to get moved on from, being refreshed by the forming and deepening of relationships, the hearing of stories, the learning about the area that you all live in together, and also appreciating the opportunity to make connections that can aid us all in the struggle to survive and flourish in often a harsh world. Given the preponderance of hunger and isolation in the modern world, it is little wonder that meal-based communities and dinner churches are on the rise in many places, both here in Australia and abroad. My guest today has spent time in a range of these communities and has brought together her experience and research along with theological reflections to write a new book on rethinking dinner, worship, and the community of God. Welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Darkinjung land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. My guest today is Kendall Vanderslice, a writer and baker who studies the intersection of food and theology. She holds an MLA in gastronomy from Boston University and a Master's of Theological Studies from Duke Divinity School. Her book, We Will Feast, Rethinking Dinner, Worship, and the Community of God, is out now with Eerdmans. Kendall also runs a range of courses on dinner churches and meal-based ministry, including how to do community and mission meals online. We talk about that a bit toward the end of the podcast. You can find out all of that at kendallvanderslice.com, where you can also get access to her Patreon, which has exciting newsletters and news and resources. So please make Kendall welcome as we talk food, Jesus, and what happens when people eat together. Well, Kendall Vanderslice, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It's great to have you. Just for our listeners, where are you, talking to us from today? And I guess, what have you been just up to of late as you navigate COVID times?
Yeah, so I am in Durham, North Carolina. I've been living here for about a little over 3 years now. I run a CSA-style bread bakery, a community-supported bread share called Companion. So essentially people buy a bread share and they get a loaf of bread every week for 10 weeks, some of them for much longer. So I spend most of my days, split between the kitchen, doing all of the baking, and then at my computer doing lots of writing and such.
Yeah, great. Or we can shout out the bread share in the episode notes if you'd like.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And I'll be curious to maybe talk at the end, because I know that you're working on a project around baking and faith. So maybe we'll come to that at the end. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I guess you can say, you were into, baking bread, but, before it was COVID cool. Like before everyone decided, I'm going to get into sourdough now. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No. So I've been baking for, over a decade. About a decade ago is when I realized that's when I wanted to make it sort of my career. So I've been and bread has been my focus for the last probably 5 years or so. Okay. So COVID was just kind of like my time when I could finally tell other people, here's how to do it. I'm so glad you all love what I do now.
That's good. That's better than no, you're not allowed to. I've been here first.
No, it was cool. I loved seeing everyone else love it as much as I do.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're going to be talking today primarily about your book, We Will Feast, Rethinking Dinner, Worship, and the Community of God, which is out with Eerdmans, and people should check it out. Really good read, and you'll see why as we talk today. But since we're going to be talking about food and as we're getting wading into the really serious, hard-hitting, investigative journalist questions that I'm going to be laying out, we'll wade in easier. So there's a Tom Waits, who's my favorite recording artist, is a great little bit in a live show where he talks about, it's always good to put the names of people in songs in case folks get lonely. And it's always good to put the names of places in case people get lost. And it's always nice to pack a lunch. And then he sings a song about food. So, which is like 47% of his songs or something. So my question is, do you have a favorite song about food?
Well, I think my answer is probably a little too on the nose, but I just truly deeply love the song We Will Feast in the House of Zion. That's all that comes to mind when I think about a song related to food. So clearly I stole the title. Not at all ashamed about it.
No, yeah, get it where you can. That's great. All right, that's really good. So as we kind of move toward the book, it's kind of thing when you start to read it, it strikes the reader, or at least struck me, as it's strange how little attention food and eating gets in theological reflection, given at a base level just how much time in our lives is spent eating. Like if we were to add up minutes at the end of our lives, obviously sleeping is probably going to be one, and eating is going to be pretty close after.
Yeah.
So, and to say nothing that it's an essential activity to our survival, and to say nothing that it's something that shows up a lot in scripture. So what drew you to thinking about food and faith? And I guess then what is to be gained by for Christians of all persuasions, for pastors, for theologians, for whoever, thinking about, or theologically thinking about the act of eating?
About food. Yeah, I mean, I have just always loved food and loved to eat, so it was a pretty sort of natural outpouring.
Right.
I really had considered going into kind of the restaurant industry for a long time. I really wanted to be a professional baker, and when it came time to, I graduated high school, I was really interested still in going down that path. And for a number of reasons, felt like I should probably get a college degree before a culinary degree, because a culinary degree is pretty limited in what you can do with it. And so while I was in undergrad, I was able to start, I was in some anthropology. I studied anthropology, so way less practical actually than the culinary degree, but I don't regret it. But so I started reading anthropology of food and these other sort of ways of thinking about food beyond just the culinary arts and beyond just the thought of how do I cook it and how do I prepare it, but what does food mean kind of more deeply in the ways that society is structured and the ways that we as humans engage with the world around us. And so with those questions, I couldn't really help but read that and ask, what does this mean for the Eucharist? What does this mean for the fact that a meal is this center point of the Christian tradition and sort of the center point of what Christ asked us as the church to do? And so that's sort of where it all started for me, was first just a hunger and love for food, but then out of that, this question of, it's just everywhere in scripture. Once you start looking, it's everywhere. And I think it's one of those things that it's so basic, it's so integral to our lives, and it's so integral throughout all of scripture that we just don't even really pay attention to it, because it's just always there. And so you almost overlook how prevalent it is. So I think there's so much to be gained by thinking about it, though, because it's fairly new in human history that we have this ability to not spend most of our time thinking about food, right? Like right now, if you add up all the time we spend eating, and it probably comes second after sleeping, but we don't even have to think about really time spent growing and harvesting and preparing to the extent that most every generation before us has had to. We have a lot of freedom, most of us, in just going to the grocery store once a week and once every other week, and just grabbing what we need.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, yeah, I think you're right. It's such an upturn that now, like, one of the most, common conversations I hear around food is like, something like an intermittent fasting. It's like, actually, how do I eat
Hmm.
less? How do I spend
Yeah, yeah.
less time? Like, I've found that, how counterintuitive it would be to except for this blip in human history, that's the thing. I'm curious because you say you came kind of through anthropology, and then I know your graduate work was in I guess
Gastronomy.
gastronomy. I
Just
thought
a fancy way of saying food studies.
yeah. Gastronomy felt too short. I was sure there was like two or three more syllables before that, so I got nervous. What did you feel like kind of coming at it from that angle to then kind of start thinking, as you say, about Eucharist and about the scripture and thing?
Mhm.
Was there something you kind of gained by like, coming from this outside view that all of a sudden was like, oh, we haven't thought about that, but this conversation has been happening, in this discipline for ages.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. Gastronomy is an interdisciplinary way of studying food, largely focused on anthropology and history. So all of our work was really thinking about kind of how does humanity engage with food, and how have we engaged with food. And so we were talking about the Eucharist in every single class that I was in, whether it was a history class, a literature class, an anthropology class. The Eucharist kept coming up, and for the most part, it was this very strange thing, like either in a historical context of like those weird Christians, they like say they're eating a human, or in an anthropology class, like kind of comparing and contrasting to other more cannibalistic forms of eating in different times and places. And so it just sort of was a common theme throughout all of this coursework. But I was one of the few people really in my program that had any kind of personal connection to it, that was regularly partaking of it, and that also was thinking about it more deeply than just kind of as a ritual. And so I think that brought a ton of helpful sort of perspective into then entering into these theological conversations, because it helped me to say, like, hey, we can talk about the Eucharist theologically, but I think we miss out on a lot when we don't first start with, like, what is a meal? What does it mean that Christ gave us a meal? And what does it mean that Jesus was sharing a meal with the people he was sharing a meal with? Um and that the early Christians, like,
Mm,
what does it mean that they were all sharing meals together? And so
mm,
I think there was just, yeah, it's also, I don't know, there's just a lot of different ways to think about it. And it's also, I think, just a lot more fun. Like, these theological debates are like, they've gotten messy and really ugly throughout history, but it's way more fun when you can start with saying, like, hey, what happens when we eat together?
yeah, totally. That's great. So the book was built from like a series of research into meal-centered communities, from all over the states. What was that process like? Going and actually seeing and sitting with these different places, and were there any I guess big surprises along the way?
Yeah, so let's see, there are, I think, 10 churches covered in the book. One of them is the early church. So unfortunately, I didn't get to go, take a field trip and
Bummer.
get to join them. I know, it really is. Got to get that time traveling
Yeah, yeah,
invented
yeah.
a little sooner. But so the others, I visited all of them in person, and it was really fascinating. I was doing this research in fall of 2016 and spring of 2017. So kind of right as the United States is beginning to contend with the
Mm,
reality of our current president. And that was really creating tense conversations within the church, either among Christians who suddenly felt very betrayed by the churches that they grew up in,
mm,
or just people within churches who no longer knew how to talk to one another. And so it was very strange doing this research. I visited churches that were across the United States, a range of geographic locations, a range of denominations, a range of um, sizes, large to small. And so there was a huge breadth of tradition and also location represented within the research. And so the pastors that I met with and spoke with and interviewed, and the people that I interviewed, all landed in very different places theologically, very different places politically. And so it was very fascinating to see how the process of eating together created this platform for them to engage in really difficult conversations when sort of the cultural norm was becoming just being impossible to engage in difficult conversations. And so I think that was probably one of the most shocking things, was that as the country was becoming further and further polarized, these churches were sort of resisting that polarization and helping to nuance conversation and just create a space for the really hard, difficult topics to be addressed.
Well, thank you for that. And I was going to ask you a question of why study the dinner church movement, but that really does, that gets at the heart of it quite well, that, something created there as a space is really fascinating. Mm.
Yeah. I also think it's valuable to study in that, I've been asked several times, like, do you think every church should become a dinner church? Or like, is dinner church the future of the church? And my answer is definitely no, I don't think so. Personally, I'm Episcopalian, and I really love, all of the smells and the bells and the, like, all the formality of the Episcopal Church. And so I don't want to give that up for, solely dinner church. But what I do think that dinner church reveals to us, and this method of just the method of eating together as an act of worship, and the relationships that can be formed in that process, and the communal and spiritual needs that are being met in this process, I think reflects something really important back to the church about what's missing in our typical rhythms and what we could do better, even within our more traditional churches.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that is like a helpful thing with the book, is like, it's not saying like, okay, now you have to scrap everything and this is the only model. It's like, you might want to consider one of these models, like you might want to do that. But like, even if you don't, like, these are questions or investigations or like that will guide you well. So early on in the book, you write this, when we eat, we experience the delight of the created order. We experience the sensory magnificence of our human bodies. We commune with one another, and through this connection with all of creation, we commune with and delight in our Creator as well. Now, kind of just jumping off the point we were just saying, this feels significant to all Christians, whatever form of church they belong to. It seems like something that all Christians in all types of churches should consider and think about how to incorporate this kind of understanding into their piety and practice. So I guess, what advice do you have for those who want to kind of center this delight, this communing into our own life with food?
Yeah, I think so often we think about our relationship to food in fairly negative terms. Even sort of our language of when we enjoy food, our language is not a positive one. It's usually a negative one. We talk about the foods that are our guilty pleasures, or we talk about the things that are an indulgence. And we cast even just the delight of eating and the delight of feasting in negative terms, and seeing it as, almost something sinful or something, we use that as a term, like that something can be sinfully delicious. And I think that does so much harm, because we see somehow the delight of feasting as at odds with sort of Christian holiness, which is just not true, and really just the opposite of how we need to approach it. And this is reflected also in the ways that so often we talk about our bodies or our relationship to our bodies. And the reality is that we worship a God that had a body, and that like God taking on a human body is a significant part of the Christian story. And if we can't talk about our own bodies in positive terms, and we can't relate to our bodies in positive terms, and can't relate to the delightful and pleasurable aspects of being in a body, then we can't fully understand the God that created us, and created us in bodies that feel and that taste and that delight. So I think starting by just recasting our language is really helpful. And then just, I don't know, actually eating and enjoying food, eating with people, and when
Totally.
it's safe, not eating with people right now if it's going to.
Yeah. Everything with that disclaimer. No, you're right. I mean, like, the Messiah came eating and drinking, and they called him a glutton and a sinner.
Exactly. Right? People thought he was a glutton and a drunk, and I mean, that's what people thought of Jesus. Then sure, let them think it of me too.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's so helpful. I think that's a really, yeah, exactly. It's okay to enjoy such things. We don't have to frame it always in I know, I shouldn't, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you for that. Um, Another line that kind of struck me early on was you have this: how can we worship a relational Lord if our worship itself doesn't build relationships? Now, the context here is about the power, of centering eating together as an act of worship, rather than kind of as an adjacent act of community that happens, next to worship.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, can you talk to us a little about the power of meals to create and foster friendship, and then why this is something the church should pursue as central,
Mm-hmm.
rather than um, in addition?
Yeah, yeah. So part of why, I mean, meals, again, going back to just the basicness of eating, meals are something that we all share, we all do, we all need. And so there's just this kind of equalizing that takes place at the table where we are all meeting this common need together in the same way. And there's, the table can function to break down community. It can definitely be a place that where power dynamics are reinforced, or where people who might already feel uncomfortable have that discomfort amplified. But when done intentionally with the express purpose of helping to welcome people in and to um, equalize a gathering, they can be really powerful. The vulnerability of the table, it can be very awkward, and it definitely makes these dinner services very awkward at times, but that vulnerability also just creates space for conversation that might not ever happen, or wouldn't happen as naturally in other contexts. And it also kind of makes those conversations a little bit less charged. You have something to do with your body, you have the safety of this table around you, you have kind of the safety of everyone sitting around in the circular or rectangular space. And you can, if things get uncomfortable, you can look down at your food, or you can get up and serve yourself another plate. Like, there are things just for your body to do that help release that tension in these vulnerable moments, and it makes it safer to then wade into some of these more vulnerable and difficult conversations. At the same time, I think when the church is gathering in such a way that meets these needs of loneliness, meets these needs of hunger for those who are food insecure, it also provides safety for people to then express a little bit more um, intimately their own deeper needs, in regards to loneliness and in regards to food insecurity. So it just kind of creates this cyclical pattern of people being welcomed into these vulnerable conversations, that vulnerability helping to express a little bit more their need, which then enables people to meet their need in a unique way, because everything around the way the church is gathering is kind of centering on all of these dynamics.
Mm.
So I think that's why having the meal be the centerpiece of church, why it works in these powerful ways. But I don't think that the worship itself has to be only a meal. But I think that by identifying sort of the power that the meal has in that way, it helps us to better see that, like, these dynamics that the church can engage around the table are not just like handy add-ons. That's the
Mm.
central work of the church. The church is meant to be a place of respite for the lonely, and a place that provides for these physical needs as well as spiritual needs. And the meal does all of that at once.
Mm. Yeah, 100%. Thank you for that. And I think I'm remembering it struck a chord as you were talking of, like, we were part of did a Bible study with a church that we were at a while ago. And partly this was built by, we were living in a small place that didn't have a lounge room, but we did it around the kitchen table. And like,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was one of the most productive and fruitful studies we've ever had. Because again, I think part of it is you have like things that make noise, and like, people can get up and open cupboards and move around,
Mm-hmm.
and also just even from a posture standpoint, you're not like on the couch like, well, it's starting to get
Yeah.
late and I'm really zoned out
Starting
in
to
this
fall
couch and
asleep.
I'm getting, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really crazy. I mean, I always encourage people to think about, like, the next time that you're at a house party or at an event, sort of like milling around, which again,
Yeah,
is not going to be as soon.
in
But how
2025.
exactly. But like, how quickly do you reach for a wine glass or a cup or something to hold on to, something to do with your body, something to sort of protect your body? It's like another layer of barrier between yourself and
Totally.
other people, that we want something that helps us feel less exposed or less vulnerable. And the table is a really great barrier that helps with that.
Because you say the great thing with the glass is, oh, it's pretty empty. I better go and get another one. It's a very easy out of a conversation or what have you. And I think the other thing that your response raised was, I often think about, when you read about like, the pictures of the community in the Gospels or then in Acts, there's always this sense of like, the basic needs being provided. And then usually somewhere after that is like a thing of like, and the Lord added to their numbers. Or when Jesus talks about if you ask and seek and knock and all that, that's after he said, make sure the community is feeding everyone and looking after everyone and is reconciled. It's like, yeah, because like I think people are going to be much more freed to ask those bigger spiritual questions, much more equipped and able to, consider their life in community and before God, if they're not also, if the mind isn't running with where are we going to get the next meal?
Yeah, exactly.
So if you are providing this place of respite, this place of safety, and actually providing for these, baser material needs, all of a sudden the ability to ask those bigger questions, and then the Spirit's ready to do its work. So I think that struck a chord too. I think really important what you're working on there.
I've been thinking a lot lately. So yesterday's Old Testament reading in the lectionary was the story of manna in the wilderness. And so I was reading through it, and it really struck me that at the end of sort of when God said, I will rain down, bread from heaven, and I will rain down the quails in the evening, it ended with, so that you will know that I am the Lord your God. And that God wants us to know first that God is the provider. That God, like God presents God's self as a provider first and foremost, and providing for those physical needs, and that's how we know that God is all that God is. And so that like the church should also be this provider and this space of provision for these very basic needs, because how else can we know God if we do not first know God as this provider?
Oh, thank you for that. So during that last response, you started to talk a bit about loneliness, and I think that's important. You have a chapter on loneliness, which your own vulnerability grants that chapter a lot of power. It's really striking. Now, loneliness is already such a potent factor in our communities. Like even pre-COVID, that was something that's so much, here in Australia and elsewhere, like this loneliness epidemic that people are talking about more and more.
Yeah.
And I can only assume that it's got, for most people, COVID has intensified it. So can you talk to us a little bit about that chapter, about St. Lydia's, which you study in that, and what the church can do to remind folks that we're never alone?
Yeah. I was really struck both in doing this research and then in sort of the year since the book has come out, just how significant loneliness is of a reality culturally, and how much that affects people's experience of the church. So the former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, a few years ago said that he named it a public health crisis, loneliness as a public health crisis, and then it has like significant physical health ramifications. Our experience of loneliness is equivalent to smoking, I think it was 15 cigarettes a day, just in the ways that it affects our heart. It affects heart disease, it affects executive function, all these other layers of things that are affected by these experiences of loneliness. And it's just wild to me that the church isn't sort of seeing that and addressing that broadly. I mean, certainly there are churches that are thinking about it, but the church should be the place where, we exist in community because we need community. And if the church is not a community that's really paying attention to that, then I think it's really lacking. And so St. Lydia's was born out of the founding pastor, Emily Scott's recognition that loneliness and isolation was so prevalent in New York City, that it was a city where people, were constantly surrounded by people, and yet it was hard to have someone over to sit at your dinner table because most people didn't have a dinner table, or just hard to get together with people because the transit system is so complex that, to get from one side of the city to the next takes an hour and a half. And it's a lot when you're wanting to just get dinner with someone. And so she wanted to respond to that loneliness and isolation. And so that's sort of what St. Ladeus was born out of. But I've just been struck that at every dinner church that I visited, from urban churches to rural churches to suburban churches, and in every community that I've spoken in since the book came out, I have had people of every age, every generation comment to me, I experience such deep loneliness, and sometimes I never feel more lonely than I do at church. And so I goodness, I can't imagine how much more prevalent that is in this particular moment. And churches are even less capable of addressing that need in the moment because, these virtual gatherings are in many ways terribly unsatisfying and necessarily unsatisfying. And I hope that there are ways, I think that there are ways that we can be creative still in thinking about how to meet those needs. But I feel like I'm just rambling at this point.
No.
It's just such a significant reality.
Yeah. Yeah, when you were saying, yes, some churches are dealing with it, but like, if you name it as a public health crisis, it's I lament that I haven't, you haven't seen denominational bodies stumbling over themselves to write, theological statements about loneliness.
Yes.
They seem much more fixated on other topics that do not need.
And I think there's, it's hard because the church has also historically not been great in talking about marriage and family and thinking in terms of the broader church community as family. Yeah. And I think this is true in evangelical spaces, in more progressive spaces, in mainline spaces. I think that there's a just lack of ability to acknowledge that in traditional families and parents who are raising kids, there's a deep loneliness because there's this isolation in this season of parenthood. For single folks in the church, there's this intense loneliness and isolation because so many churches focus primarily on families and kids. For, those who are widows and widowers, there's a deep loneliness because, especially when it's at an unexpected age, just a lack of recognition that kind of these seasons of life make it really hard to bring people into contact with those who are different than them in ways that can address those lonelinesses. And so that's part of what I saw really unique about dinner churches was that they're so intergenerational and that it was building these friendships across people that are in different phases of life. And it helped people to realize the ways that their unique phases enabled them to address the loneliness that existed of people in other phases. So we had at Simple Church, which was the church community I'm most familiar with, we had a single guy who was in his, early 20s. And there was this 4-year-old girl who was like, she had determined that he was her best friend. And she would, every night after the service, she wanted him to sweep with her. And so they became like the sweeping buddies. That was their job for picking up afterwards every time. And this 4-year-old's dad was a single father, and he now, while his daughter was sweeping with this other friend, was freed up to have adult conversation for kind of one of the few times in his week where he had adult conversation with others that wasn't about work, that wasn't about his daughter, that was just kind of just time for him. And so at the time that like this little girl's needs are being met because she just wants the joy of, a young adult who thinks she's cool, and this other guy's needs are being met because he just wanted time with kids because he spent so much time alone and just with other single folks in his age range. But then at the same time, the single dad has this unique need met. And so it's, they're all able to meet one another's needs by being in this intergenerational context. And that's just something that the church tends to stratify us by age and by life phase. And that's exactly the opposite of what we need.
100%. That's so great. Thank you for that. So yeah, in the various communities you observed, you mentioned this kind of in the introduction that none of these churches are like problem-free or challenge-free. Were there any particular challenges that you saw kind of popping up again and again that kind of, are maybe more unique to meal-based meal-centered communities, and any kind of, I guess, creative ways of meeting those that you also saw.
Yeah, so the biggest kind of roadblock that everyone has to figure out how to contend with is just the financial aspect of it. These churches are necessarily small, and in a moment of church decline, it is very encouraging to sort of value that smallness, but funding a really small church is complicated, especially a church that tends to have as big of a range of just folks from various socioeconomic classes in them. And so it was really hard. They can't sustain themselves for the most part through internal giving alone. And so for the most part, they were trying to think about how can we be creative so that we're not dependent on internal giving, because actually this dependence on internal giving might be something that is shaping the church in unhelpful ways. So I think one of the most creative ways, so Simple Church, again, this church in Grafton, Massachusetts, which is where my research began and where I actually worked there for a year, they just built a series of trades that they as a church engage in. So the trade that I worked with them on was bread baking. So we would bake bread together on Thursdays, and then we would sell that bread at the farmers market. And the farmers market was in this kind of city center area, and the church where we met was just directly off of it. So we'd sell the bread in the farmers market, and it was a great time for community members to be a part of the actual baking process. They enjoyed coming to the market and helping to sell, but it also was a way of getting to know people within the community. And, we would tell them, oh, we're Simple Church. We meet right over there. Come have dinner with us. Our service was just a few hours after the farmers market ended. So we could just tell people, like, take your stuff home and come back and join us. You'll get even more bread. And so that just was a really creative way of meeting this financial need, but it also met some really important communal needs. People were able to get involved in unique ways, especially folks who wouldn't have been able to give financially to the church. They were able to give of their time and help with the bread baking. And so that was just really significant. But bread is not their only trade. They've also done some carpentry and woodworking. They have a farmer that attends the church who they partner with, and he provides all the produce that's used for the meal that they serve. They have done like website building and just a variety of other things. It's a way to really just think about, like, what are the gifts and the talents that exist within our community, and then how do we use those to meet these needs rather than just thinking in financial terms.
Yeah, that's really great. And as you say, like, standing next to someone in a market for however many hours, is a great way to get to know someone who's part of your community who maybe you haven't before, or deepen a relationship, because again, it's that kind of, it's time, but it's often conversation you can have while they're picking up a thing. Exactly. Or it's, they say, like, the best way to have a conversation with a kid is in the car because you're not looking at each other. It's in a similar way, you can have a little thing that's not as intense as, like, I'm sitting across from you, like, let's have a talk. That's great. No, I think that's really important. Obviously that's, that the funding thing is obviously a thing that, Fresh Expressions as a general broad movement obviously have to face. So it's interesting to hear that as an approach. A question I've been thinking about as we've been going, so, and kind of, talking about the markets and things like that, and kind of jumping back to an earlier question, earlier quote about, communing with God and with all of creation. And the particular time we live in now, like we live in that time, as you say, that we don't have to really think about how we're going to get food, how it's going to be prepared, where we're going to get the time for that. We also less and less have to think about what food is in season. Now, like, to some extent, I love this because our 3-year-old's favorite food is watermelon, and I live in an age where I can get it at any time of the year. It's just always in the fruit and veg shop or the supermarket or what have you. But, generally, most foods have a seasonal quality. And I'm curious about, we're seeing a rise in that kind of, maybe that farm to table, that kind of more market, locally produced stuff, which would then naturally require a bit more of a attention to that kind of seasonal ebb and flow of what foods are available. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that as, again, its own way of kind of attuning ourselves to this world as created, and created in a particular way compared to kind of a more managed world where we have figured out ways to hack, to often to great ecological cost, found ways to hack the system.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the church already operates on this like calendar that shifts with the seasons. The liturgical calendar kind of carries us through the narrative drama of the gospel over the course of the year. And our seasons do that as well. Our seasons, we go from, winter is this time of death that then leads us into spring, which is a time of new life. And the foods that are available in those times also kind of cause us to think about this relationship between death and resurrection, and just the role that these necessary times of kind of fallow fields and of more fruitful fields are part of how we eat and how we get good things out of the ground. And I think that when we lose sight of that, we lose sight of, I think, these larger ways that just kind of these cycles of life and death and these cycles of provision and times of feast and times of famine are just part of the rhythms of the world and of creation, and also a reality that people have been dealing with throughout the whole story of Scripture. Is a story of people engaging with these same realities and these same concerns and fears of, is it going to rain? Is it not going to rain? Are we going to have food? And it's also stories of God working within these cycles, but then also sort of jumping in and disrupting those cycles. Like, again, back to the story of manna, of God just saying,
Yeah,
I'm going
yeah.
to totally disrupt this whole cycle. Like, you can plan all you want, and I'm just going to rain that bread. So I think there's, just huge potential in helping churches to kind of rethink about these rhythms and these cycles and these shifts. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one kind of last question is, we've been obviously touching on COVID throughout, but, you could have had no anticipation that when you were writing this book that probably all 9 of those communities that you visit are not meeting currently, or I don't know whether they are or not, but most likely they had to have some break. And most churches have had to go online, and most restaurants, or a lot of restaurants, are closed, or at least people aren't going to, this disruption that is probably, one of the things that's been hit the most is public, obviously public gatherings, but particularly public gatherings around food. I guess, if you were like all of a sudden, like Eerdmans were like, quickly, we need to put a little afterword on, just to address this matter. Obviously things will emerge and change again. But do you feel like, if anything, you're like, man, the book is all the more important. Like this movement is all the more important. We're just going to have to figure something out. And it's pointed to this, an issue that was kind of latent is now right on the surface. And this is, again, all the more vital. What, just any thoughts you've had as you've kind of been doing these speaking engagements or rethinking about the book, just in this moment of like, wow, didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the book is all the more important in this moment. I think in one sense, it helps us to better understand why the loneliness and unsatisfaction of our separation is so significant, because it helps us to really think through what it means to be created for embodied relationships and created for this need to sit together and be together. So I think it helps us to understand some of what we're feeling and experiencing right now. But I also think that, the whole focus is on, like, how do we rethink and be creative and be a bit innovative within the context of tradition, which is what everyone's having to do now. And so I think kind of a barrier of the book up until COVID was that people just didn't want to rethink the way that they were doing things. And even just having the word rethinking in that title, people were like, this is great for some people, but like, my church is cool how it is.
Yeah, easy does it. Easy.
Exactly. But it's like, everyone has to rethink now. So what do we do?
No.
And so I have been doing a lot of work on helping churches to host virtual meals, virtual agape meals, because the other strange piece of it is that we are having to really rethink and re-understand the role of communion within the church, as churches are deciding, do we do it virtually? Can we do communion virtually? Do we abstain for 6 months or more? What is the ramification of just not taking communion for this long? And so it, I think, is a space to also help us creatively think through, like, how do we Yeah, how do we
Yeah.
be creative in this moment? And so these virtual meals have been a really helpful sort of way to help churches step in and meet some of those communal needs and spiritual needs that exist within their congregation that can't be met in just translating their traditional service into a virtual setting. And so that has
Yeah.
been really exciting to be able to see churches really receptive in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have been just to dinner church. And I think looking forward, when we are able to finally gather together once again, I think there's going to be a long season of grief and
Mm.
reflection and um, just thinking about how do we move forward. It's not, we realize now there's not just going to be one day that we're all able to meet back in our normal manner.
Yeah.
My church has been gathering again just for the last few weeks for outdoor services, and it's very very apparent who's missing. We have a congregation that generally skews much older, and so there's only a handful of us that are younger, and we're pretty much the only ones going because we have to sit in the cold in the morning,
Yeah.
and um, still take on a bit of risk to do this.
Yes.
And so it's just very apparent that, like, okay, our season of grief and of wrapping our minds around like what is happening and how is this changing our world and how is this changing our church communities is going to be, I think, pretty long and extended. And I
Mm.
think that these dinner churches and this dinner church model creates a space for churches to wrestle through these questions and to grieve and lament together as we move forward. So I do think that there will be, I still don't think that dinner church is the future of church, but I think that there's going to be a really specific need for this kind of gathering in the coming
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, the book is We Will Feast, Rethinking Dinner, Worship, and the Community of God. And as Kendall said, we all need to do some rethinking. It's an excellent book. It's really helpful the way it's based around the research, good investigation into food and the Bible, a wide range of communities, as Kendall said before, and very readable and just 100%. You should check it out and get it if you haven't already. Kendall, how else can people connect with you? And yeah, give us a little hint about what we should be looking forward to coming off your desk in the next little while.
Yeah, so the easiest way to find all of my different sort of avenues is at my website, www.kendallvanderslice.com. And through there, you can sign up I have a monthly free newsletter called Edible Theology that is a collection of essays on food and faith, as well as recipe and my own reading recommendations and podcast and media recommendations around the web. And then I also have one additional monthly paid newsletter that I send out that is also called Edible Theology, but you can support me through Patreon, and then you get that second newsletter as well. Also, if you're in the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, North Carolina area, you can get my bread through Companion Bread Share. And finally, I have a website, edibletheology.com, where you can also sign up for the newsletter, but find courses and curriculum that help pastors think through how to start dinner churches and meal-based services within their own community. So those are sort of the various places to find me. But I'm doing a lot of writing right now on bread. So hopefully there will be some bread book news in the not too far future.
Is the like people want to know about the agape meals, the virtual meals, that on the Edible Theology side as well?
Yep, that's on edibletheology.com, and all of it is linked from Kendall Vanderslice. They all kind of interlink with one another. But I do have an online course that that gives you all the information you need to start a virtual agape meal.
Oh, excellent. Well, so those links will all be in the show notes, but they're pretty simple websites, so you might be able to figure it out even without that. Kendall Vanderslice, thank you so much for coming on Love, Rinse, Repeat. It has been a blast. I've learned a lot, and it was a lovely, fun, bubbly interview for the start of a Tuesday morning. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.